I never imagined I'd be the kind of person who could look their own mother in the eye and tell her she had 1 week to leave my house. Yet, after watching my third boyfriend walk away because of my mom's constant interference, I finally understood I had to choose between my own happiness and her emotional manipulation. Before I delve into this wild story that completely reshaped my life, consider subscribing to this channel. I have so many more family drama narratives that will absolutely astound you. And please, share in the comments if you've ever found yourself having to choose between your own life and keeping a controlling family member content. For a long time, I genuinely believed I was losing my mind, until I realized how many people navigate similar situations. My name is Sarah, I'm 23, and I work as a graphic designer here in Portland, Oregon. I'd been living in my own apartment for about 2 years, a modest 1-bedroom place I was still paying off, but it was undeniably mine. I had poured myself into college, internships, and weekend freelance work, doing everything possible to secure my own space and independence. My mom, Linda, is 48. She had been divorced from my dad for about 5 years, a messy and traumatic period for her, and I truly felt for her. She transitioned from being a stay-at-home wife for 2 decades to suddenly having to support herself, find a new home, and navigate complex legal matters. It was a nightmare. When she initially asked if she could stay with me temporarily after the divorce was finalized, I didn't hesitate. She was my mother, after all. She mentioned needing maybe 2 months to get back on her feet, find a job, and save for a security deposit on her own place. It seemed like the least I could do, given everything she'd endured. That was nearly a year ago. What began as my mom crashing on my couch for a couple of weeks somehow evolved into her completely taking over my life. I'm not exaggerating. She genuinely treated my apartment as if it were her own. She rearranged my furniture without asking, handled my grocery shopping, and became annoyed if I bought items she didn't approve of. She even had opinions about the thermostat setting. But the most unbearable part, the one that finally pushed me to my limit, was her constant meddling in my relationships. This wasn't limited to romantic connections. It extended to my friendships, my dating life, and even my interactions with coworkers. She held an opinion on everything and everyone, and she was never hesitant to voice those opinions. Looking back, I should have recognized the red flags earlier. I remembered bringing my college friend Emma over for dinner, and my mom spent the entire evening asking Emma incredibly invasive questions about her family, her job prospects, and whether she was serious about her career. Emma later messaged me, expressing that she felt like she was being interviewed for something. At the time, I laughed it off, but in hindsight, that was merely the beginning. Then there was the incident with Jake, a man I had met at a coffee shop near my office. We had been texting for a few weeks, and finally decided to go on a proper date. I was genuinely excited about him. He was witty, had a good job, and seemed truly interested in getting to know me. However, the moment I mentioned to my mom that I was going out with someone new, her questions began immediately. She wanted to know his last name, where he worked, what kind of car he drove, our date location, and my expected return time. When I pointed out that I was an adult and didn't need to provide a detailed itinerary, she adopted a hurt expression, claiming she was merely concerned for my safety given the prevalence of dangerous men. The date with Jake went very well. When I returned home around 11 p.m., my mom was still awake, waiting for me in the living room. She immediately began pressing for details about the date, whether I liked him, and if I planned to see him again. I tried to be polite, simply stating it went well, but she continued to push for more information. Over the next few weeks, as Jake and I continued dating, my mom's behavior grew increasingly peculiar. She would make subtle comments about him seeming nice enough, but cautioned me not to get too attached too quickly. When he came to pick me up for dates, she would invent excuses to come out and chat with him, asking about his job and family in a manner that felt more like an interrogation than casual conversation. Jake began to joke that my mom seemed more interested in dating him than I was, but I could sense his discomfort. And honestly, I felt the same way. I felt unable to truly enjoy getting to know him because my mom was constantly inserting herself into the situation. The climax of that situation arrived about a month and a half into Jake and my relationship. We were becoming more serious, discussing exclusivity, and I was genuinely starting to like him. Then, one day, He simply stopped responding to my texts. There was no explanation, no gradual fading out, just complete radio silence. I later discovered that my mom had encountered him at the grocery store and decided to have a friendly chat about me. She had informed him that I was still figuring myself out and suggested he shouldn't expect too much too soon, explaining that I had been heartbroken before and she was merely looking out for me. Jake, apparently, left that conversation believing my mom was trying to warn him that I was emotionally unstable or unprepared for a relationship. He decided the drama wasn't worth it. When I confronted my mom about it, she feigned ignorance, claiming she had no idea what I was talking about. She maintained she was just being friendly, and that if Jake couldn't handle a conversation with my mother, then he probably wasn't the right person for me anyway. It was then that I began to realize this wouldn't be a temporary situation, nor would it improve on its own. The insidious nature of living with my mom, which I hadn't fully grasped initially, was how gradually she encroached upon every aspect of my daily life. It wasn't as if she moved in and immediately began making demands or setting rules. It was far more subtle, which likely explains why it took me so long to recognize the severity of the situation. It started with small gestures that seemed helpful, even sweet. She would do my laundry while I was at work, which was genuinely pleasant at first, as I detest doing laundry. But then she began reorganizing my closet according to her aesthetic preferences, and suddenly, half my clothes mysteriously vanished because she had deemed them unflattering or inappropriate. She would cook dinner for us, which again seemed like a kind gesture, but then she would become offended if I wasn't hungry when she desired to eat, or if I made plans to grab dinner with coworkers after work. She started planning our meals a week in advance, and would become genuinely upset if I disrupted her schedule by wanting to order pizza or try a new restaurant. The grocery shopping became a significant issue. She would go to the store while I was at work and return with an abundance of food she liked, but that I would never purchase for myself. When I arrived home to find she had spent around $150 of my money on organic this and gluten-free that, I would try to address it gently, but she would immediately become defensive. She would claim she was merely trying to help me eat healthier, or that she had more time to shop than I did, thus doing me a favor. When I suggested we discuss groceries before her shopping trips, she would act hurt and imply she was merely being a burden. This became her default response to any criticism or boundary I attempted to establish. She would instantly reverse the situation and cast herself as the victim. If I asked her for some space in the evening to decompress after work, she would claim she hadn't realized I found her company so unbearable. If I mentioned I would prefer to have friends over without her joining our conversations, she would assert her understanding that I was embarrassed by her. This constant emotional manipulation made me feel guilty for desiring basic privacy and independence in my own home. I began to question whether I was being unreasonable or selfish for wanting boundaries with my own mother. My friend Emma, who had experienced that uncomfortable dinner, started noticing changes in me. She would inquire why I never invited people over anymore, or why I always seemed stressed and on edge. When I attempted to explain the situation with my mom, Emma would listen, but I could tell she didn't truly comprehend the extent of it. I believe from an outsider's perspective, it probably appeared as though I was simply being dramatic about normal mother-daughter dynamics. My mom was always incredibly sweet and charming when others were present. She would cultivate an image of being the devoted single mother, immensely proud of her successful daughter, and how we were best friends who cherished spending time together. People would comment on how fortunate I was to have such a close relationship with my mom, and how endearing it was that she was staying with me during a difficult period in her life. I began to feel as though I was crazy for being bothered by her behavior, because everyone else seemed to perceive our living arrangement as lovely. But what they didn't witness was her monitoring my phone conversations, always inquiring about who I was speaking with and what we were discussing. They didn't see her waiting up for me when I went out with friends, demanding a full debrief of my evening upon my return. They didn't observe her making comments about my appearance, my career choices, my friends, all under the guise of being helpful or concerned. The most insidious part was her mastery of delivering these comments in a seemingly caring manner that was actually quite cutting. She would remark on how she hoped I wasn't overworking myself because I looked tired lately, or how she thought it was commendable that I was confident enough to wear certain outfits, even if they weren't the most flattering. She possessed a unique ability to undermine my confidence while appearing supportive. And because I had been living with this daily for months, it was genuinely starting to affect my mental state. I found myself second-guessing decisions I would have previously been confident about, wondering if she was right about aspects of myself I should change. My work began to suffer because I was constantly distracted by whatever drama was unfolding at home. I would receive texts from her throughout the day, asking about my return time, my dinner preferences, or if I had remembered to do various tasks she believed I should. If I didn't respond immediately, she would send follow-up messages expressing concern for me. My boss actually pulled me aside one day, inquiring if everything was all right at home, noting my distraction and inconsistent work quality. That served as a wake-up call, as my job is incredibly important to me, and I had worked diligently to build a strong reputation at my company. I realized that my mom's presence in my life had become so overwhelming that it was impacting my professional performance, my friendships, and my ability to cultivate any romantic relationships. Yet, I still felt trapped, because every time I attempted to address these issues with her, she would make me feel guilty for being ungrateful or insensitive to her struggles. She would remind me of the difficulty of her divorce, her immense sacrifices during my upbringing, and her hurt that I didn't seem to appreciate her efforts to help me. She would cry, claiming she had nowhere else to go, no one else who cared about her. This constant emotional blackmail prevented me from establishing the necessary boundaries. I felt responsible for her happiness and stability, even though it came at the cost of my own well-being and independence. I began avoiding my apartment as much as possible, staying late at work or lingering at coffee shops just to avoid confronting whatever mood she was in. However, this only made her more clingy and demanding when I was home, as she perceived my avoidance. The entire situation was becoming completely unsustainable, but I didn't know how to resolve it without completely destroying my relationship with my mother. Things truly began to escalate when I started dating Marcus, about 2 months after the Jake situation. I had met Marcus through work. He was a freelance photographer hired for a project my company was undertaking. We immediately connected, and for the first time in months, I felt excited about getting to know someone new. However, I was also terrified of introducing him to my mom. After what had transpired with Jake, I knew I needed to be more cautious about how much information I shared with her about my dating life. Consequently, I initially didn't mention Marcus at all. I would tell my mom I was working late or meeting friends when I was actually on dates with Marcus. It felt absurd that I was lying to my own mother about something as normal as dating, but I simply couldn't endure her commentary and interference again. For a few weeks, this strategy proved quite effective. Marcus and I were getting to know each other without any external pressure or strange family dynamics. We would go to restaurants in different neighborhoods, spend time at his place, or meet at coffee shops far from where my mom might unexpectedly encounter us. But lying to my mom about my whereabouts and companions turned out to be far more stressful than I had anticipated. She would ask detailed questions about my work meetings and friend hangouts, and I had to meticulously remember the stories I had fabricated to maintain consistency. Moreover, she was growing suspicious about my sudden constant busyness. She would comment on my perpetual absence from home and how she felt we barely saw each other despite living in the same small apartment. She would inquire why I was always so dressed up for work lately, or why I seemed to be in such a good mood upon returning home. The entire situation reached a critical point about a month into Marcus and my secret dating. We were having dinner at a small Italian restaurant downtown, and I was actually beginning to relax and enjoy myself without constantly worrying about my mom's reaction to everything. But then, I looked up from my pasta and saw my mom entering the restaurant with her friend Carol. My heart plummeted, knowing there was no way to avoid this confrontation. My mom spotted me immediately and approached our table with a huge, artificial smile. She feigned surprise at seeing me there, as if it were a mere coincidence. But I could discern from her expression that she was furious about catching me on what was clearly a date. She introduced herself to Marcus, putting on a grand display of being the charming, friendly mother delighted to meet my friend. But I could see her meticulously observing every detail about him: his attire, his appearance, his posture, what we were eating, and the apparent intimacy of our conversation. Marcus handled the interruption gracefully, attempting polite conversation with her, but I could tell he was confused by my apparent tension and discomfort. My mom lingered by our table for about 10 minutes, barraging Marcus with questions about his work and background, while I sat there feeling utterly mortified. After she finally returned to her own table, Marcus inquired if everything was all right, noting my evident distress. I attempted to explain the situation with my mom, without making it sound overly dramatic, but I could tell he was beginning to grasp the presence of significant family dysfunction. When I arrived home that night, my mom was waiting for me in the living room, and she was clearly displeased. She immediately demanded to know why I hadn't told her I was dating someone, and why I had been lying about where I was spending my evenings. I tried to explain that I simply desired some privacy and space to get to know Marcus without external pressure, but she interpreted it as a personal attack. She expressed disbelief that I didn't trust her enough to be honest about my dating life, and conveyed her hurt that I'd been sneaking around as if I were doing something wrong. Then she began criticizing Marcus himself. She remarked that he seemed okay, but noted he was likely a few years older than me, expressing concern about his intentions. She inquired if I had investigated his background, if I knew anything about his previous relationships, and if I was being careful about protecting myself financially. On the surface, these concerns appeared reasonable, but the way she presented them felt more like an attempt to sow seeds of doubt in my mind, rather than genuinely looking out for my well-being. She repeatedly emphasized my perceived naivete regarding people's motivations and the importance of caution before becoming too deeply involved too quickly. Over the subsequent weeks, my mom's behavior around Marcus became increasingly problematic. Whenever he came to pick me up for dates, she would invariably find reasons to interact with him, asking about his work projects, his family, and his living situation. She would offer him drinks and snacks, attempting to persuade him to sit down and chat with her instead of simply picking me up and leaving. Marcus consistently remained polite during these interactions, but I could sense his growing discomfort with the intrusive and personal nature of my mom's questions. She would ask him about his long-term plans in Portland, his career aspirations, and whether he desired children someday. These were not the casual getting-to-know-you questions one asks a daughter's new boyfriend. They resembled the questions one might pose during a job interview, or to determine suitability for marriage. I began to notice Marcus suggesting we spend more time at his place, or meet at restaurants instead of him picking me up at my apartment. When I questioned him about it, he was diplomatic, but admitted that my mom's level of interest in our relationship was a bit overwhelming for him. He explained that he understood her protectiveness, especially since I was her only daughter, and she had endured a difficult divorce. But he felt her questions were more akin to an interrogation than friendly conversation. He was attempting to be understanding, but I could tell it was starting to affect his comfort level with our relationship. I knew I needed to have a conversation with my mom about boundaries, but every time I tried to bring it up, she would deflect or become emotional. She would claim she was merely trying to get to know the person I was spending time with, and that she found it strange I didn't want her to have a relationship with my boyfriend. She would point out that in healthy families, parents and their children's partners maintain friendly relationships, and that she was simply trying to be welcoming and inclusive. She would make me feel as though I was being paranoid or oversensitive for perceiving anything inappropriate about her behavior. But deep down, I knew that what she was doing was neither normal nor healthy. The level of involvement she desired in my romantic relationship felt invasive and controlling, not protective and caring. I simply didn't know how to address it without precipitating a major family crisis. The situation with my mom wasn't solely impacting my romantic relationships. It was beginning to completely isolate me from my friends as well. What had started as occasional comments about my social life had evolved into constant monitoring and commentary on everyone I spent time with. My college friend group used to gather at my place quite regularly. We would have movie nights, game nights, casual get-togethers where we'd order takeout and catch up on each other's lives. However, after my mom moved in, these gatherings became increasingly uncomfortable for everyone involved. Initially, my mom would occasionally join us, which seemed normal enough, but she possessed a knack for inserting herself into our conversations in a manner that felt truly intrusive. If we were discussing work, she would interject with advice on career choices and professional development. If we were talking about relationships, she would share far too many details about her own dating experiences, or begin asking incredibly personal questions about my friends' love lives. My friend Katie mentioned to me after one of these hangouts that my mom seemed excessively interested in everyone's affairs. and not in a friendly way. She noted that it felt more like my mom was collecting information about us, and that some of her questions had made people uncomfortable. I started noticing that my friends were inventing excuses not to come over anymore. Emma, who used to drop by my place constantly just to hang out, suddenly claimed to be busy whenever I suggested she come over. When we did make plans, she would propose meeting at coffee shops or going to restaurants instead of gathering at my apartment. My friend Alex was more direct about it. He told me that my mom made him feel as though he was being interviewed every time he visited, and that her questions about his job, his family, and his personal life felt inappropriate coming from someone he barely knew. Alex expressed his understanding that my mom was enduring a difficult period with her divorce, but emphasized that her behavior was making everyone in our friend group uncomfortable. He suggested that perhaps she was struggling to adjust to living with me and was overcompensating by attempting to be overly involved in my social life. The most egregious incident occurred when I was hosting a small birthday party for my friend Jessica at my apartment. I had specifically asked my mom to perhaps stay in her room or visit her friend Carol that evening so my friends and I could have some privacy to celebrate. However, about an hour into the party, my mom emerged from her room and began mingling with everyone as if she were a guest at the party, rather than someone who lived there. She produced photo albums from my childhood and started showing embarrassing pictures to my friends, recounting stories about my upbringing that I absolutely did not wish to share. Then she began asking people incredibly invasive questions about their relationships and families. She asked Jessica why she wasn't married yet, given she was turning 25, and whether she was actively seeking a serious relationship or merely playing around. She asked my friend Mike about his job at a startup and whether he believed his career was stable enough to support a family someday. She asked Emma about her student loans and whether she was concerned about her financial future. These were not the kind of questions one asks at a casual birthday party. They were the deep, personal inquiries one might reserve for close friends after years of acquaintance. My friends were being polite, unwilling to be rude to my mother, but I could see everyone's discomfort. The party concluded much earlier than usual, with people offering excuses about early mornings and other commitments. After everyone departed, I attempted to discuss with my mom how her behavior had made my friends uncomfortable, but she immediately became defensive. She asserted she was merely trying to be friendly and get to know the people important to me. She acted hurt that I didn't want her to have relationships with my friends, claiming she felt I was attempting to keep her separate from my life. When I explained that her questions had been too personal and invasive, she claimed she didn't understand why everyone was so sensitive about normal conversation. She stated that when she was my age, young people were more open and friendly, and that my generation was too guarded and suspicious. She made it seem as though the problem lay with my friends for being uncomfortable, not with her inappropriate behavior, and she made me feel guilty for not appreciating her efforts to be involved in my social life. After that party, my friends largely stopped coming over altogether. We would meet at bars, restaurants, coffee shops, or at other people's places, but never at my apartment. I felt as though I had lost the ability to host gatherings or have casual hangouts in my own home. The isolation was beginning to significantly impact my mental health. I felt as though I was living in a fishbowl, where every conversation I had, every person I interacted with, every decision I made was subject to my mom's commentary and judgment. Even when I wasn't home, I would receive texts from her throughout the day, asking about my whereabouts, my companions, my activities, and my expected return time. If I didn't respond immediately, she would send follow-up messages expressing concern for me. She had also started making comments about my appearance and lifestyle choices that were truly undermining my confidence. She would remark on how she hoped I wasn't gaining weight, because my clothes seemed tighter lately, or that she was concerned about how much money I was spending on dining out and entertainment. She would suggest that perhaps I should be thinking more seriously about my future, about finding a stable relationship and settling down, about saving money for a house and planning for children. These conversations always felt less like motherly advice and more like criticism of my current choices. I felt unable to make any decisions without considering my mom's reaction, and that every aspect of my life was being evaluated and judged by someone who held very different priorities and values than I did. The stress of living under this constant scrutiny was beginning to affect my work performance, my friendships, and my overall happiness. I was becoming anxious and irritable, and I felt as though I was losing my sense of independence and autonomy. I knew something had to change, but I didn't know how to address the situation without completely destroying my relationship with my mother, or making her feel abandoned during a difficult period in her life. The guilt and obligation I felt toward her were keeping me trapped in a living situation that was becoming increasingly unbearable. The breaking point with Marcus arrived about 6 weeks into our relationship, precisely when things were becoming truly serious between us. We had begun discussing exclusivity, meeting each other's friends, and perhaps taking a weekend trip together. I was genuinely starting to believe this could be something real and lasting. However, my mom's interference had been steadily escalating throughout those 6 weeks. What began as casual questions about Marcus had evolved into full-scale monitoring of our relationship. She would ask me detailed questions about our dates, our destinations, our conversations, the physical progression of our relationship, and whether I was diligently using birth control. These conversations felt incredibly invasive and inappropriate, but whenever I attempted to convey to my mom that my relationship with Marcus was private, she would become upset, claiming she was merely concerned about my well-being. She would remind me of her greater life experience and assert her ability to discern red flags that I might overlook due to being blinded by infatuation. The specific incident that ended things with Marcus occurred on a Thursday evening when he was scheduled to come over for dinner. I had been genuinely excited about this date, as I planned to cook for him for the first time, and we anticipated a quiet, romantic evening at my place. I had asked my mom to perhaps go out with her friend Carol that evening, so Marcus and I could have some privacy, but she claimed she didn't feel like going anywhere and would simply remain in her room. I should have known that wouldn't be the case. About 20 minutes after Marcus arrived, my mom emerged into the kitchen while I was cooking and began chatting with him about his photography work. What started as casual conversation quickly transformed into something far more intense and personal. She began inquiring about his previous relationships, whether he had ever been married, the reason for his last relationship's termination, and his long-term desires in a partner. Marcus attempted to be polite and answer her questions, but I could see his growing discomfort. Then she started asking him about his financial situation, whether he owned or rented his apartment, his career goals, and whether freelance photography provided stable income. She framed these questions as merely being interested in getting to know him better, but they felt more like a job interview or a background check. The worst part was when she began asking him questions about me. She wanted to know what he liked about me, whether he believed I was mature enough for a serious relationship, and if he was concerned about my career prospects in graphic design. I stood right there, listening to this conversation, feeling utterly humiliated. My mom was essentially asking my boyfriend to evaluate me as relationship material while I was in the room. It was as if she were treating me like a child incapable of speaking for herself. Marcus attempted to deflect these questions by speaking positively about me and changing the subject, but my mom persisted. She claimed she was merely trying to understand his intentions, and that as my mother, she had a right to know whether he was serious about me. The conversation reached its peak when my mom began recounting my previous relationships to Marcus and explaining why they hadn't worked out. She told him about Jake and the circumstances of that breakup, implying that I had a pattern of becoming too attached too quickly and being unrealistic about compatibility. She expressed hope that Marcus would be patient with me, as I was still learning to navigate adult relationships, and conveyed her trust that he would be honest with her if he began to have doubts about our future together. At that point, Marcus politely excused himself to use the bathroom, and I followed him into the hallway. He appeared completely shell-shocked by what had just transpired. He conveyed that my mom's questions had crossed several lines, and that he felt as though he was being interrogated rather than getting to know his girlfriend's mother. He explained that he understood my mom's protectiveness, but that her level of involvement in our relationship felt inappropriate and controlling. He asked if this was normal behavior for her and whether she had done similar things with my previous boyfriends. I attempted to explain that my mom was enduring a difficult period and was likely just being overly cautious because she cared about me. But even as I made excuses for her behavior, I knew that what she had done was completely unacceptable. Marcus stated he needed some time to consider whether he was comfortable continuing our relationship with this level of family drama involved. He expressed his strong liking for me, but admitted he wasn't sure he could handle having my mom constantly monitoring and evaluating our relationship. He left that evening without staying for dinner, and I spent the next hour arguing with my mom about what had just happened. She insisted she had merely been trying to get to know Marcus better, and that if he couldn't handle normal family interaction, then perhaps he wasn't the right person for me. She claimed she was disappointed that I was more concerned about Marcus's feelings than about appreciating her efforts to look out for me. She acted as though I was being ungrateful and disloyal for criticizing her behavior. Over the next few days, Marcus became increasingly distant. He would respond to my texts, but his replies were shorter and less enthusiastic than usual. When I suggested we make plans for the weekend, he claimed to be busy with work and suggested we could talk later. I could feel him pulling away, and I knew it was because of what had happened with my mom, but I didn't know how to resolve the situation without essentially choosing between my relationship with Marcus and my relationship with my mother. The entire situation culminated the following week when Marcus finally called me, stating he needed to be honest about his concerns. He told me that while he cared for me deeply, he wasn't comfortable with the level of involvement my mom expected to have in our relationship. He felt as though he was dating both me and my mother, and that every decision we made as a couple would be subject to her approval and commentary. He explained he needed to be with someone who maintained healthy boundaries with their family, and that he didn't believe I was ready for that kind of independence. Marcus ended our relationship that same day, and I was utterly devastated. This was the second relationship that had concluded due to my mom's interference, and I was beginning to realize that this pattern would persist unless something changed. But when I attempted to discuss with my mom how her behavior had contributed to the breakup, she expressed sorrow that Marcus couldn't handle being part of a close family, but asserted that his reaction proved he wasn't the right person for me anyway. She claimed that any man who truly loved me would understand her significant role in my life, and that her opinion and involvement mattered. She made it seem as though Marcus had failed some kind of test, rather than acknowledging her inappropriate behavior. I realized that my mom was never going to take responsibility for how her actions were affecting my relationships, and that I would continue to lose people I cared about unless I found a way to establish some serious boundaries. The Marcus situation was devastating, but what transpired next finally illuminated the deliberate and calculated nature of my mom's interference. About 3 weeks after Marcus and I broke up, I started chatting with a new guy named Ryan on a dating app. We had been messaging for a while and shared really good chemistry, so we decided to meet for coffee. I was being extra cautious this time, completely refraining from mentioning Ryan to my mom. I reasoned that if I could keep this entirely separate from my home life, perhaps I could genuinely get to know someone without all the family drama interfering. David and I met at a downtown coffee shop, and we immediately hit it off. He was funny, interesting, held a good job in marketing, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. We ended up talking for about 3 hours, which felt incredible after months of feeling unable to connect with anyone due to the stress at home. We made plans to see each other again the following weekend, and I was actually feeling optimistic about dating for the first time in months. I believed I had figured out how to manage the situation by simply keeping my dating life completely private from my mom. But then something truly bizarre occurred. David suddenly stopped responding to my messages. We had been texting quite regularly for about a week after our coffee date, making plans for our second date, and then he simply vanished. No explanation, no gradual fading out, just total radio silence. I was confused and disappointed, but I assumed he had simply decided he wasn't interested and didn't know how to gently let me down. It happens, right? People change their minds about dating for all sorts of reasons. But then, about 2 weeks later, I ran into David at a grocery store near my apartment. He seemed incredibly uncomfortable when he saw me, but I decided to simply say hello and inquire about his well-being. I figured if he wasn't interested in dating, we could at least be friendly. What David revealed during that conversation completely blew my mind and altered everything I thought I knew about my mom's behavior. He explained that about a week after our coffee date, my mom had contacted him through Instagram. She had somehow discovered his last name and found his social media profiles. She had sent him a direct message, identifying herself as my mother and expressing a desire to speak with him about me. David recounted that my mom had told him I was going through a difficult emotional period and wasn't truly ready for a serious relationship. She had claimed I had been struggling with anxiety and depression since her divorce, and that I had a pattern of becoming too attached too quickly to men who weren't right for me. She had informed David that while she appreciated his interest in me, she was concerned I might be using dating as a means to avoid dealing with my emotional problems. She had suggested he might consider giving me some space to work on myself before becoming involved in anything serious. My mom had presented all of this as being concerned for both my well-being and David's. She had claimed she didn't want to see me get hurt by rushing into a relationship when I wasn't emotionally stable, and she didn't want David to become entangled in something complicated and potentially dramatic. David explained that the message had been incredibly convincing because my mom had appeared so caring and thoughtful about both of our feelings. She had provided specific examples of things I had supposedly said and done that indicated my emotional struggles, and she had framed her concern in a way that made David feel as though she was protecting both of us. He had decided that if my own mother was warning him that I wasn't ready for a relationship, then he should probably heed that advice. He had believed he was being respectful and kind by quietly withdrawing, rather than becoming involved in a situation that might be harmful to both of us. When David told me all this, I was absolutely speechless. I couldn't believe that my mom had actually sought out someone I was dating and sabotaged our relationship by pretending I was mentally unstable. The level of manipulation and deception involved was beyond anything I could have imagined. I asked David to show me the message my mom had sent him, and reading her words was one of the most shocking experiences of my life. She had written a long, detailed explanation of my supposed emotional problems, including things that were either completely fabricated or twisted versions of normal life experiences. She had told David that I had been devastated by my previous breakups, and that I had been seeing a therapist to deal with attachment issues. She had claimed I had been having trouble sleeping, and that I had been acting erratically at work. She had even suggested that I might have inherited some emotional instability from my father's side of the family. None of this was true. I wasn't seeing a therapist. I wasn't having problems at work. And I certainly didn't have attachment issues or emotional instability. My mom had essentially created a fictional version of me that painted me as someone who was mentally unwell and incapable of healthy relationships. The most disturbing part was the detailed and convincing nature of her lies. She had clearly put significant thought and effort into crafting a message that would deter David, while making herself appear as a caring, protective mother, simply looking out for everyone involved. When I confronted my mom about what she had done, she initially attempted to deny it. She claimed she had no idea what I was talking about, and that David must have been confused or fabricating things. But when I showed her screenshots of the messages David had shown me, she could no longer deny it. Then she completely shifted her strategy and attempted to justify her actions. She claimed she had been trying to protect me from being hurt by another man who wasn't serious about me. She asserted she could tell from my behavior that I was becoming too attached to David too quickly, and that she was worried I was setting myself up for another heartbreak. She claimed she had only contacted David because she cared about my emotional well-being, and that she had been trying to spare me the pain of another failed relationship. She acted as though she had done me a favor by sabotaging my potential relationship with someone she had decided wasn't right for me. When I told her that her interference was completely inappropriate and that she had no right to contact people I was dating, she became angry and defensive. She claimed that as my mother, she had not only the right, but the responsibility to protect me from making poor decisions. She stated that if I were mature enough to make good choices about men, then I wouldn't require her intervention. But since I had already experienced several failed relationships, she implied I clearly needed guidance and protection from someone with more life experience. That conversation was when I finally realized that my mom's behavior was not going to change, and that she was never going to respect my autonomy or my right to make my own decisions about relationships. She genuinely believed she had the right to control my dating life, and she was willing to lie and manipulate to maintain that control. I understood for the first time that this wasn't about her being protective or concerned. It was about her needing to control every aspect of my life because it made her feel important and needed. After the entire David situation, I finally realized I needed professional help to figure out how to manage my mom's behavior. I had never been to therapy before, but I was beginning to feel as though I was losing my mind trying to deal with this situation on my own. I found a therapist named Dr. Chen who specialized in family dynamics and boundary issues. I was incredibly nervous about my first appointment, unsure how to explain what was happening without sounding like I was merely complaining about normal mother-daughter dynamics. But Dr. Chen immediately understood my descriptions. She explained that what my mom was doing had a name: emotional manipulation and enmeshment. She clarified that some parents struggle to allow their adult children to become independent, and they employ guilt, control, and manipulation to maintain an inappropriate level of involvement in their children's lives. The most eye-opening insight Dr. Chen offered was that my mom's interference in my relationships wasn't truly about protecting me from unsuitable men. It was about preventing me from forming close bonds with other people that might threaten her position as the most important person in my life. She explained that my mom perceived my romantic relationships as competition for my attention and loyalty, and that she was sabotaging them to ensure I would continue to prioritize my relationship with her above all others. This made so much sense when I reflected on my mom's behavioral patterns. She had never genuinely been concerned about whether Jake, Marcus, or David were good people or suitable partners for me. Her concern had been about them consuming time and emotional energy that she desired me to dedicate to her instead. Dr. Chen educated me about healthy boundaries and helped me understand that setting limits with my mom wasn't cruel or ungrateful. It was essential for my own mental health and development as an independent adult. We worked on practical strategies for establishing boundaries, such as learning to say no without explaining or justifying my decisions, refraining from sharing personal information my mom might use against me, and refusing to engage with guilt trips or emotional manipulation. Dr. Chen also helped me understand that my mom's emotional reactions to boundaries were not my responsibility to manage. She explained that my mom might cry, become angry, or threaten self-harm when I began setting limits, but that these reactions were manipulative tactics designed to make me back down. She taught me that truly loving someone means respecting their autonomy and right to make their own decisions, even when you disagree with those decisions. What my mom was doing wasn't love. It was control, disguised as love. After a few weeks of therapy, I began implementing small boundaries at home. I stopped sharing details about my workday, my social plans, or my feelings about things with my mom. When she asked invasive questions, I would offer vague, non-committal answers instead of detailed explanations. I also stopped seeking her permission or approval for decisions that were mine to make. If I wanted to go out after work, I would simply go out without discussing it with her first. If I wanted to order takeout instead of eating what she had cooked, I would order takeout without explaining my choice. My mom immediately noticed these changes and was clearly displeased. She would inquire why I was being so distant and secretive, and why I no longer wished to share things with her. She would claim she felt I was pushing her away, and that she didn't understand what she had done wrong. When I attempted to explain that I was simply trying to establish some healthy independence, she would become upset, claiming she believed we had a closer relationship than that. She would remind me of everything she had done for me during my upbringing, and everything she was enduring with her divorce. The guilt trips were intense, and there were definitely moments when I almost succumbed and reverted to our old patterns. But Dr. Chen had warned me that things would worsen before they improved, and that my mom would escalate her manipulation tactics when she sensed her control slipping. She was right. My mom began doing things like crying whenever I set a boundary, claiming she felt she was losing her only daughter, stating she didn't know where she had gone wrong as a mother. She would bring up my childhood and all the sacrifices she had made for me, attempting to make me feel guilty for desiring independence. But the more I learned about healthy relationships in therapy, the more I could see the manipulative and unhealthy nature of my mom's behavior. I started recognizing her patterns and refusing to engage with them. I also began rebuilding my social life outside of my apartment. I reached out to friends I had been neglecting and started making plans that didn't involve my mom having any input or involvement. I started going out more often and staying away from home as much as possible. Dr. Chen encouraged me to consider what kind of living situation would genuinely work for me long term. She asked me to contemplate whether having my mom as a permanent roommate was sustainable and what impact it was having on my ability to develop as an independent adult. I had been so consumed by guilt regarding my mom's difficult situation that I hadn't truly considered my own needs for well-being and development. But after several weeks of therapy, I began to realize that having my mom living with me indefinitely wasn't just uncomfortable. It was actually harmful to both of us. Dr. Chen helped me understand that by enabling my mom's dependence on me, I was inadvertently preventing her from developing her own independence and coping skills after her divorce. She needed to learn how to build her own life and social support system, and living with me made it too easy for her to avoid that necessary work. I started to see that setting boundaries and eventually asking my mom to move out wouldn't be cruel. It would actually be the healthiest course of action for both of us in the long run. But I also knew that making that transition would be one of the most challenging things I had ever done. After about 2 months of therapy, Dr. Chen and I began seriously discussing the possibility of asking my mom to move out of my apartment. I had been working on smaller boundaries for weeks, but the fundamental problem, that my mom was living in my space and treating it as her own, remained unaddressed. Dr. Chen helped me understand that as long as my mom was living with me, she would continue to feel entitled to control and monitor my life. The physical boundaries of having separate living spaces were necessary for establishing emotional and psychological boundaries. I knew this conversation would be incredibly difficult, but I also knew I couldn't continue living as I had been. The stress and anxiety of constant monitoring and control were affecting every aspect of my life, and I wouldn't be able to build healthy relationships or achieve independence while my mom treated my apartment as her home. Dr. Chen and I spent several sessions planning how to approach this conversation. She helped me anticipate the various ways my mom might react, and we practiced responses to the guilt trips and manipulation tactics I knew were coming. The most crucial lesson Dr. Chen imparted was that I didn't need to justify my decision or convince my mom of its reasonableness. My apartment was my space, and I had the right to decide who lived there. I didn't need my mom's permission or approval to ask her to leave. She also helped me understand that my mom's emotional reaction to this news was not my responsibility to manage. If my mom cried, became angry, or attempted to make me feel guilty, those were her emotions to deal with, not mine to fix. We also discussed practical considerations, such as giving my mom a reasonable timeline to find her own place, and the kind of support I was willing to offer during her transition to independent living. Dr. Chen suggested I might offer to help my mom look for apartments or provide a reference for rental applications, but emphasized the importance of being clear about the types of support I was and wasn't willing to provide. She warned me not to become entangled in managing every aspect of my mom's housing search, as that would merely be another form of the codependent relationship I was attempting to change. Before having the conversation with my mom, I also reached out to my dad to inform him of the situation. My parents had been divorced for 5 years, but they remained in contact because of me, and I wanted to ensure my dad understood the situation in case my mom contacted him for support. My dad was actually very understanding about the whole thing. He mentioned he had noticed my mom struggling with boundaries and independence since their divorce, and he believed it would likely be healthy for both of us if she learned to live on her own. He offered to assist my mom financially if she needed help with a security deposit or first month's rent, which was a huge relief, as I had been concerned about the financial aspect of her move. I didn't want my mom to be unable to afford her own place, but I also didn't want to be financially responsible for supporting her indefinitely. I also spoke to a few close friends about my plans. Emma was incredibly supportive, stating she had been worried about me for months due to my apparent stress and isolation. She believed asking my mom to move out was probably the best thing I could do for myself. My friend Alex expressed pride in me for taking steps to address the situation, and assured me that he and our other friends would be there to support me through whatever drama might result from this conversation. Having that support network in place made me feel more confident about proceeding with my decision. I knew that no matter how my mom reacted, I had people in my life who understood why this boundary was necessary, and who would help me maintain it. I decided to have the conversation with my mom on a Sunday evening when we were both home and relatively relaxed. I had spent the afternoon at Dr. Chen's office for a final preparation session, and I felt as ready as I would ever be. Dr. Chen had emphasized the paramount importance of remaining calm and factual during the conversation, regardless of how emotional my mom's reaction might be. She had reminded me that I was making a reasonable request based on my legitimate needs as an adult, and that I didn't need to apologize for prioritizing my own well-being. I had written down some key points I wanted to ensure I covered during the conversation, including a specific timeline for my mom's departure, the kind of support I was willing to offer during her transition, and what our living arrangement would look like going forward. I was nervous, but I was also relieved to finally be taking action to change a situation that had become completely unsustainable. I knew that no matter how difficult this conversation would be, it was necessary for both my mom and me to learn how to have a healthy, independent relationship. I also understood that this would likely be the most important conversation I had ever had with my mother, and that my handling of it would set the tone for our relationship moving forward. I was scared, but I was also determined to finally stand up for myself and establish the boundaries I needed to live my own life. The conversation I had been planning with my mom ended up happening sooner than I expected, and in a much more dramatic way than I had prepared for. About 3 days before I was planning to have the "you need to move out" talk, something occurred that completely escalated the situation. I had been following Dr. Chen's advice about maintaining boundaries and refraining from sharing personal information with my mom. So, when I started chatting with a new guy named Ryan on a dating app, I didn't mention it to her at all. I had learned my lesson about keeping my dating life completely private. Ryan and I had been messaging for about a week, and had made plans to meet for drinks the following Friday. I was actually feeling optimistic about dating again for the first time since the David incident, but I was also being extra cautious about protecting this potential relationship from my mom's interference. But somehow, my mom found out about Ryan anyway. I still don't know exactly how she figured it out, whether she had been going through my phone when I wasn't home, or monitoring my social media more closely than I realized, or what. But she definitely knew I was talking to someone new. On Thursday evening, the night before my date with Ryan, my mom approached me while I was cooking dinner and stated she needed to discuss something important with me. She wore a serious, concerned expression that immediately made me suspicious. She claimed she had been reflecting on my recent behavior, my increased distance and secretiveness, my more frequent outings without disclosing my destination, and my apparent withdrawal from our relationship. Then she expressed concern that I was repeating the same mistakes I had made in my previous relationships, and that I was about to become involved with someone unsuitable. When I inquired about her meaning, she deflected the question, stating that wasn't the important thing. She claimed what mattered was that she knew I had been talking to someone new, and that she was worried I was rushing into another relationship without learning from my past experiences. Then she said something that completely blindsided me. She told me she had been contemplating my emotional state over the past few months, and that she was concerned I might be developing some kind of mental health issues that were affecting my judgment about relationships. She claimed she had noticed my increased anxiety and irritability lately, my isolation from family, and that my behavior patterns reminded her of some of the mental health issues that ran in my dad's family. She suggested I might consider seeing a therapist to work through these issues before getting involved with anyone new. And then she stated that as someone who loved me and was concerned about my well-being, she felt she had a responsibility to protect me from making decisions that might be harmful to my mental health. The conversation took an even more disturbing turn when my mom mentioned she had been considering reaching out to Ryan to share her concerns about my emotional stability, just as she had done with David. She claimed she knew I would be upset with her for interfering, but that she would rather have me angry with her than watch me self-destruct in another unhealthy relationship. She stated that if I couldn't make sound decisions about my dating life, then she would have to step in and make those decisions for me. At that point, I completely lost it. I started yelling at her about the utter inappropriateness and manipulative nature of her behavior, and how she had absolutely no right to interfere in my relationships or contact people I was dating. I told her there was nothing wrong with my mental health, and that the only reason I had been anxious and irritable was because of her constant monitoring and control of my life. My mom immediately started crying, claiming she couldn't believe I was attacking her for trying to help me. She insisted she was merely concerned about my well-being, and that if I couldn't see that, then perhaps I truly did need professional help. Then she said something that made me realize the gravity of the situation. She told me that if I insisted on dating Ryan despite her concerns, she was going to contact him and inform him about what she termed my emotional instability and my pattern of unhealthy relationships. She claimed she would rather have me hate her temporarily than watch me make another mistake that would harm my emotional development and future happiness. When I told her that if she contacted Ryan, I would ask her to move out of my apartment, she looked shocked for a moment. But then she claimed that if I kicked her out for trying to protect me, that would simply prove I was experiencing some kind of mental health crisis. She stated that no mentally healthy person would choose a stranger they had been talking to for a week over their own mother who had sacrificed everything for them.